We'll go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone to this ISEE North American chapter sponsored webinar. We're really excited to be joined by Saba Qureshi, who is a science editor at Environmental Health Perspectives. She primarily focuses on human observational studies. She's an ISEE member and received her PhD in epidemiology from the University of Washington. And so she will be guiding us through today, talking about writing and publishing papers. So please take it away.
Thanks, Joan, and thanks, Marianne, for organizing and getting this webinar to actually happen. I think we originally submitted this as a workshop for ISEE last summer. We can get this out there. Let me just start my share screen. Just a second. Okay, thanks, Marianne. Appreciate the thumbs up. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So as Joan mentioned, this is on writing and publishing in environmental epidemiology research. And I'll be going through kind of the basics of writing and submitting a paper. It's tend to be most useful to early career researchers, but there might be tips for those who've published in the past before and how to get your work out there. I will go through, but if you have questions along the way, feel free to interrupt me, or there should be plenty of time at the end for questions as well. I might not see if you're raising a hand, so maybe just speak up if you have a question. So today I'll be talking a little bit about co-author requirements and selecting a journal to publish in, but the bulk of the presentation will be on scientific writing and then the submission and review process. So first I wanted to talk a little bit about choosing co-authors. You may choose your authors based on study involvement and expertise. It's pretty important to discuss roles and expectations early. Nobody should be surprised that they're a co-author on a paper when it gets to the submission stage. They should have already been involved writing the paper. And there are specific guidelines and criteria for defining the roles of authors that are set by the ICMJE, which is the International Committee for Medical Journal Editors, that most journals kind of, they might not explicitly ask you to list out the roles for each authors, but they'll ask for all authors to meet these criteria. So I won't read these out, but these are the criteria. They essentially require that all authors make substantial contributions to the work, either the design of the study or the analysis of the study, that they are all involved in revising it and writing the content, not just for kind of copy editing, but the actual scientific and intellectual content of the paper. And they all should have final approval of the version to be published. So the summary there is really that all authors listed on a manuscript should contribute and review the manuscript. One other thing I wanted to mention is when submitting a paper, all authors will, for most reputable journals or all reputable journals, will have to disclose potential conflicts of interest. So this disclosure statement is the disclosure statement that Environmental Health Perspectives, or EHP, has listed on their website. The statement itself might differ journal to journal, but they all kind of have the same concept where you're disclosing any either potential financial or non-financial conflicts of interest. Again, this is for all co-authors, not just the submitting author. So financial interest, I think most people have a concept of what that might be, but non-financial interest might be something like an affiliation with an advocacy group. Maybe if a co-author served as an expert witness on a trial that involved your pollutant of interest or your outcome of interest, or if they're a board member of a certain advocacy related organization. The kind of rule of thumb here is if you're unsure if something is a conflict of interest, it's just better to declare it. And this is different from the acknowledgement section of a manuscript. The acknowledgement section might list kind of all of your grant funding from independent sources, such as the NIH or other government grants. This is kind of a separate section than that. And the point here is really just transparency. So readers and reviewers have a sense of who the authors are. Next thing I'll talk about is choosing the right target journal. So first and foremost, you want to find a journal whose scope fits your topic of study. So by scope, I mean, what does the journal publish on? What is their topic that they cover? Look at journal websites for their definition of their scope. Some might be really broad, some might be pretty narrow. You can look at previously published papers from journals you're considering to see, do the exposures and the outcomes and the methods that they typically publish on match your study? Have they published similar studies to you? One thing to keep in mind is that if a journal has very recently published a study that's essentially exactly like yours or very similar to yours, they might actually not be interested in your paper since they just published on it. So I would take a look at, maybe the most recent table of contents for a journal to see, are the topics similar to yours, but not too similar, which is a little bit of a balance. If you're not sure where to start looking for journal options at all, take a look at, where are your references published? What journals have they published in? Because they're obviously, interested in similar topics. You can look in PubMed do a search on similar topics and see where journal papers are published and look at those journals. And also consider specialty journals. So, you can publish in an environmental epidemiology journal, an epidemiology journal in general, but you can also look at journals that focus on your specific exposure or outcome. You can look at journals that are more regionally focused. So if your study took place in a certain region, maybe there's a journal who has special interest in work going on in that region. Another thing to keep in mind is, unfortunately, cost and logistics. So most journals are either restricted or open access. So restricted means there's a cost to access an article or a journal or the journal itself. Open access means it's available without a fee, so without restriction. Getting open access sometimes costs. So when I say open access to readers, gaining open access sometimes requires a cost for a journal, for an author. So you might have to pay for your article to be open access, so publicly available. The reason this is important is that some funding agencies have requirements around this, specifically the NIH. If you have NIH funding, they have public access policies where any work coming out of NIH funding needs to be accessible by the public. So that's something that will be listed on a journal's website. If you kind of dig into wherever it has the author submission information, there'll be information on whether the journal is open access or not, and whether open access costs anything. So just keep in mind what your requirements are for your work. Another related topic is that different journals will have different copyright procedures. So sometimes when you publish with a journal, you transfer over your copyright to the journal itself for your work. Sometimes the copyright remains with you, the author. That might be important if you need to have a paper publicly accessible. Other costs that come into play, there can be publication and submission costs, so keep that in mind, and those will all be listed on a journal's website. Some journals are free to publish in and submit to, some are not. There are a lot of costs that can add up pretty quickly. Another thing to keep in mind is sometimes journals will have affiliations with societies or give kind of discounts if you're from under-resourced countries on those fees. So if something like that applies to you, take a look at that and take advantage of that. I'm pretty sure if you're an ISEE member, you get a discount for publishing in environmental epidemiology. So for those of you who are members, you can take advantage of that. And lastly, I'll mention something to be aware of and kind of be wary of is predatory publishing. So these are publishers who exploit the need for academics and researchers to publish in order to make money. It's a money-making scheme. What they'll do is charge pretty exorbitant fees for publishing. There's really little to no peer review. They'll take your paper, they'll publish it as long as you pay them enough. There's really a lack of any editorial transparency or reputation. These journals often won't actively solicit journal submissions and then charge you excessive fees. So if you're getting, an unsolicited email from a journal you've never heard of that has a weird name, that is a kind of off topic, and they're saying, we welcome you to submit to our journal, that's a red flag. These can be pretty difficult to identify if you're unsure if the journal you're trying to submit to is a predatory journal. Talk to your mentors, your co-authors, try and get advice to see if they have any idea. They've heard of the journal before, what they think of if it has a reputation for being a predatory publisher. If you're really unsure and you can't find the advice you need, you could potentially even reach out to someone like ISEE. I'm sure the Student Researcher Network or the CAPE Committee would be happy to help you identify if something in a related field is a predatory publisher. Other important factors to think about while you're, see a chat, I don't know if that's a question, so speak up. Other important factors to think about while you're considering where to publish are, does the journal you're considering publish the type of paper you're writing? Are you writing a research paper and the journal only publishes reviews? Or are you writing a review and the journal only accepts original research? Make sure your paper fits what the journal actually publishes. Other things to keep in mind are length limitations. I would say at submission, you don't have to be particularly overly careful about this, but if your article is, say, like 8,000 words and they have a 3,000 word limit, that is going to be an issue at submission. Try and make sure your paper fits the overall requirements as much as you can at submission. Another thing to keep in mind is the kind of balance between a time to decision versus the impact of a journal and the impact that your paper might have, which is more important to you. Often the more high impact journals can take a lot longer for the review and the publication process. And maybe a lesser tier journal might be a lot faster, even, they might go through a review process, but usually their kind of time to decision is a lot faster. So say you're working on a paper and you really need to get it published in order to graduate or to get promoted. You might take that into account when deciding what journal to publish in. Maybe your goal is to get your work in the highest impact journal possible. In that case, the time isn't as important to you. So just things to keep in mind when you're deciding where to publish. Think about the likelihood of a favorable decision. It's always great to aim high, but be realistic about your work and your paper. If you're not sure what that means, get advice from your co-authors and your mentors. You can look at a journal's acceptance rate. Most of them will be on their website. What percentage of submitted papers do they actually end up publishing? Look at a journal's impact factor and compare them across the journals you're considering. So now I'm going to launch into scientific writing and kind of go through the elements of a standard research paper. So a standard research results paper. I'm not going to go through every part of the paper, but just kind of some basics about what expectations are for the main sections. We'll talk a little bit about kind of what you should do pre-submission. So the first part of your standard paper is the introduction. The goal here is really to explain the rationale for your study. This should be pretty short and to the point. Why is this topic important? Why will your paper advance the knowledge? Here, you're really moving from broad to narrow. So the big picture of the issue down to what your study is doing. So you start the introduction kind of framing, why is your study important? Why does this matter? Why should readers read this? The middle part is a brief review of previous literature. This should not be a complete review that comes later in the paper, but really just setting up the reader so they have the knowledge they need in order to understand your study hypothesis and your study, nothing beyond that. Maybe you could point out key knowledge gaps from previous research that you're trying to address. That's really the middle of your introduction. And you should end with just a very brief, probably sentence or two, description of your study and the objectives. The next section of your paper is the method section. So here, the goal is really to provide all of the information needed in order to replicate and interpret your study. Try and use clear, simple language, avoid jargon, try and be careful about the use of acronyms. It's fine to use acronyms when warranted. When you do, always be sure to define them so readers know what the acronym is. Even if you think it might be commonly used, maybe somebody's reading from outside your subspecialty and they don't know what it means. Everything should really be defined. Also use consistent terminology as much as possible. This is just to avoid confusion. If you switch between a couple terms that mean the same thing, that will confuse a reader. And also make sure your methods are reported completely. So if a result is reported or mentioned, the method used to obtain it should be described in the method section. This includes all sensitivity analyses, secondary analyses, ad hoc analyses. This kind of differs from an analytic plan, right? So in an analytic plan, you're describing what you plan to do, but in a method section, you should really be describing everything that you did do, which often differs. So the first part of your method section should really be describing your study. So in full detail, you should describe your study design. Was this a cohort study? Was this a case crossover study? Was this a longitudinal study? Make sure it's specified, even if you think it's obvious. Describe your study population, including the number of participants or subjects. If there were any specific inclusion or exclusion criteria from, say, a larger study, make sure to mention that. Mention the location and the time period of your study. Be sure to fully define your outcome and your exposures of interest, and also describe any data collection tools. So any questionnaires that were used or any biologic samples that were collected. Make sure to describe how they were collected, how they were processed. Make sure to describe all of the laboratory assays and how they were performed. Then the second part of your method section is really describing your data analysis. So the text order for your data analysis should be presented in the order of application. So first, start with any methods you might have used to define the data. So if you log transformed your data, or you did any kind of data handling techniques at the beginning before you even launch into any analysis. If you had lab measures, be sure to describe, what were the limits of detection? How did you handle values that were below the limits of detection? Everything kind of regarding how you pre-process your data and how you clean your data. Next, move into describing any descriptive analyses you might have completed. Then move into your model specification. So what type of analysis did you conduct? What was, how was that handled? Then move into your covariate identification and selection. So how did you decide which covariates were collected in your, or which covariates were included in your analysis? Make sure to specifically also define all of your covariates and how they, was it a continuous variable? What were the units? What, was it a categorical variable? All of that should be defined in this section. Also be sure to describe the source of all of your covariate information. Was this pulled from a questionnaire? Was it a medical record abstraction? Was it some other source? All of that should be defined for each of your covariates. Then you can move on to describing any test for trend or dose response analyses or any effect modification that you tested for, and then go into any sensitivity or secondary analysis here. So next, moving into the results section. So your reporting of your results should be complete. All analyses should be presented in some way. This is including all sensitivity analyses. So in your results section, you might not list all of the results for every single sensitivity analysis, but you should at least kind of summarize what the findings were and then present the full results somewhere in the paper. We'll describe it in a second. These should be presented in the same order as the methods. And the text should complement and be consistent with the tables and figures. So, the results that you're showing should match what you're showing in the actual tables. This is an opportunity for you to highlight important findings or patterns and provide meaningful information of what your study found. Try to avoid just presenting raw data and raw numbers and kind of just listing out everything that is in the table to try and focus in on what is important. When you're writing your results, it's always important to provide your measure of precision. So if you're providing an effect estimate, provide the confidence intervals that go with it in the text, even if it's also in the tables. Be explicit about your comparison groups, and always indicate your exposure contrast for effect estimate. So what were the units? Are you reporting something for 1 unit change or 10 unit change? What is the specific unit you're looking at? So that all goes into how readers are going to interpret results. So I kind of mentioned that, for sensitivity or secondary analyses, you might not have room in the results section to list all of the results. So something you can take advantage of is supplemental material. So supplemental material and the use of it kind of varies by journal. So be sure first to check requirements. Some journals will specify what can or cannot be included in the supplement, and some journals actually do not allow for a supplement at all. But in general, this section of a manuscript is really meant for transparency and supporting information. So this is where you can provide additional results that may be too long for the main manuscript, and this is outside of your primary results, but are important for transparency. For example, if you present your results in the manuscript as a forest plot, you might include the full table of your actual numeric results in the supplement, or you might present a full set of results from the sensitivity analysis in the supplement that was only summarized in the results section. Again, it's really important for transparency's sake. Potentially, future researchers might use your results for a meta-analysis, and if they don't have access to the numeric data behind your results, they won't be able to include your study. The numbers might actually also be used for potential policymakers in the future who would need to see the numbers behind your results. So keep in mind, as a general rule, the article, though, should stand on its own without the supplemental material. It's really just a resource for transparency. One other thing I want to mention a little bit is kind of data and code sharing requirements. Check journal requirements, because I think more and more often there are requirements or suggestions for how data sharing and code sharing is handled by journals themselves. So you may need to, at minimum, depending on the journal, include a statement about how to obtain data if it's at all possible. You might be kind of requested or recommended to share your analytic code on GitHub or a similar repository. Just double check what the journal is requiring. And the last section of your write-up is your discussion section. So this is really where you go into the interpretation of results. So how does your study contribute to the weight of the evidence of your topic? Just a reminder, not to overinterpret your study on its own. Your study really will not prove or disprove anything on its own. So you really want to contextualize it in context of all of the work in the topic. So the text order here for your discussion is really the opposite of your introduction. So here you're starting with the specifics of your study and then moving into the more general context and implications. So you'll start by summarizing your study question and objective, and then your major findings. And then here is where you kind of launch into a deeper dive into the literature. Well, you do a review of the literature on the topic, more in depth in your introduction. You can talk about how your findings relate to prior research. Do your findings support or differ from prior research? And then going into the limitations of your study, be honest and realistic about any study limitations here. And then talk about the strengths of your study. Again, what does your study add beyond the previous work? And lastly, your conclusion. So just kind of summarizing everything together. And again, just be careful kind of not to overinterpret the importance of your single study. And then just one quick slide on kind of how the results section and the discussion section kind of differ and how you should kind of tone your language differently here. So the results section is really just an objective description of what your findings from your analysis are. So the example here is descriptive characteristics of the study population are presented in table 1. There were more men than women. So just straightforward, objective description of what the number said, no interpretation. The discussion section is really where you can move into the interpretation of your study findings. So the example here kind of hypothesizes why there may have been more men than women in the study population. So that interpretation is really should be reserved for the discussion section. And lastly, I'll just quickly mention the abstract. And the reason I'm talking about this last, even though it's usually the first thing people read, it's because it's really the last thing you should write. So the abstract should really represent the content of your paper. It's a quick peek at what is to come for the reader. Some journals will require kind of a structured abstract where you lay out each of the sections that mimic your full paper. Some will not require the structure, but an abstract should still include the same information. And it's really just kind of providing the key factors for each of the section in a short summary. So motivating the readers as to why the problem is important, what is your study asking, what were the basic methods of your study and your key results, and then again, providing some conclusions that are supported by your study and data. One thing I want to mention a little bit is about plagiarism. So it's never acceptable to use someone else's words or ideas without attribution. So just be careful when doing background research to distinguish what notes are from what source. If things are direct quotes, try and keep track of that. If you're in doubt, it's always best to err on the side of caution. Most of the time, plagiarism is unintentional, but consequences are the same. Most journals will kind of routinely do anti-plagiarism checks. They use software that compares your submitted manuscript to all of the published work that's available on the internet, essentially. And that software looks for overlap in words and content to previously published work. So here, consequences really would be, if no foul play is suspected, which there really ever is, the journal or the editors might come back and ask you to revise your manuscript based on overlap they might have found with other papers. As long as that's done, it's usually fine. If an author does not comply with this routinely or repeatedly, then it might result in a rejection of the manuscript. Something to keep in mind is also something called self-plagiarism. So if you have previously published work and you're just reusing your words, even though they are your words, they still might be copyrighted by the journal they were previously published in. So that is still an issue, even though they are your words. And the last thing on this section I want to talk about is writing and revising. So when you are writing, think about the papers you've read. What makes a good paper good? What makes a bad paper bad? When you've been reading kind of your paper in preparation to write your own paper, other papers in preparation to write your own paper, what has worked in the papers you've read? Try and get pre-submission feedback as much as possible, of course, from your co-authors. That's a criteria. But you can also get informal reviews from colleagues, from mentors, or even people outside your specific area of expertise. Be considerate of the people you ask to review and their time. One thing you can do is just request targeted input. So maybe ask somebody to review a certain section that you're not sure of. If there's one that you're having trouble with, you can ask somebody to look at just that section. Also get help with language and grammar. If you're not a good writer, have someone who is a good writer read and edit your paper. And this doesn't even need to be anybody with any sort of scientific expertise. Ask a family member, ask a friend who is a good writer to read through your paper and make sure it makes sense. So I'm going to launch into the submission and review question unless there are any quick questions. Okay, I'm not hearing any, so I'll keep moving forward. So here we're going to talk a little bit about submitting your paper. So it's always important to follow journal instructions, I will say, to a degree. First and foremost, again, I'll mention it, I already did. make sure the
Saban,
type of,
sorry to
yes.
interrupt. Nargis has her hand raised, so we have a
Okay,
question.
thank you.
Yes.
I'm not seeing
Sorry
hands
for the
or anything.
interruption. Nargis, do you want to unmute
sorry,
yourself
I
now?
could wait, but yeah, I was happy to wait, but okay, thank you anyway. Look, what I want to say is that plagiarism and the software that's checking plagiarism is really becoming a big nuisance for writers. And not the fact is that we are not copying from anybody, but there are many common phrases that everybody uses, and the software picks up these common phrases. For example, you've written there that this study was financially supported by the University of whatever. Okay, this sentence might have been repeated in 100 papers, and then it's picking this up and saying that this is plagiarism. Or like in your statistical analysis, you're writing, I use SPSS software. It's picking this up as plagiarism. So what should we do with situations? It's really becoming a nuisance with situations like this.
Right. No, just thank you for your question. And I totally see where you're coming from. So I can only speak to how we handle things at EHP, because that's my experience. But I will say, when we run these checks, we get kind of a report back that has a percentage. But we kind of, for papers we're considering, a science editor will always read through the report and look at the actual content that the plagiarism software is detecting. And we can see like, oh, is this just picking up an acknowledgement section? If so, we ignore it. Or is it picking up kind of that these kind of nuisance things that are really just not anything substantive. And if we notice that, then we kind of ignore it, even if it might have a high plagiarism score, we ignore it. If we're seeing, that there are whole sections of the discussion section that have overlap with another paper, that's where we'll go to an author and say, we notice this overlap where this paragraph is similar to a paragraph in the previous paper. So I will say that is what we do. I can't say for certain what other journals are doing. But we really will review those reports for the content, not just based on kind of a yes, no, pass, fail score.
Thank you.
Yeah. Right, I think. Keep going.
Yes. Yep. Thank you.
Right. Thanks. Again, sorry, I'm not seeing any of the hands or anything. So thank you for interrupting me. So just moving into submitting your paper. Again, I was mentioning it's important to follow journal instructions, again, to a degree. So make sure your article type that you're submitting matches the article types that the journal accepts. Look at the formatting and word limits, including kind of what are the manuscript sections and the order of the sections the journal is expecting. Try and match that as much as possible. So it doesn't have to be perfect. The concern here is the manuscript readable? If a journal is asking for an introduction methods and results separately, but your methods are scattered throughout the paper, that can make it difficult for the editors and the reviewers to read and understand what you did, just because it's not how they requested information and what they're looking for. If you're not sure of what's required before submission, reach out to the journal and ask for help or clarification. I'm sure they'll be happy to answer your questions. Here is just kind of a general schematic. This is provided by Wiley on the peer review process. And I'll go through each of these steps a little bit right now and then more in depth. So you submit your article. My mouse over. Submit your article. The first step is an initial screening. And this is done by a journal editor. Editor roles differ by journals. Some editors are time with the journal. Often editors are volunteers with the journal who've worked with the journal for a long time as a reviewer or a contributor. Journals will have multiple editor roles, but typically there's at least an editor-in-chief, and then a handling or an associate editor who handles individual papers. So this initial screening will be done by an editor with relevant expertise. And really they're looking at, does your paper fit the scope of the journal? Is your paper novel? Is there potential that it'll have impact? Is it written clearly? If an editor thinks it's good enough to move forward, it'll move to that handling editor to handle a paper. Say at EHP, there are multiple opportunities kind of at that screening level for multiple editors to look at your paper and move it forward. And then the next step, so say your paper makes it through the screening step, and it goes to a handling editor, and they send it out for peer review. After peer review, once the reviewer comments come back, they'll go back to the handling editor, and the editor will make a decision based on the comments from the reviewer and their own assessment. That decision will typically either be an accept or reject, or most typically a revision request, where they'll ask the author to make revisions on their article. And then once those revisions come back in, kind of goes through the cycle again. So it might get sent out to peer review again, potentially, not always. And then the editor will make a decision on the revised manuscript. And then eventually the paper is accepted. After the acceptance phase, there's still a production step before your paper goes on to publication. So who's involved with all of these decisions and processes? So first, there's the editor-in-chief. The editor-in-chief is really responsible for all the content in the journal, and they make all final decisions. There are the handling editors that I mentioned that work with individual papers and authors. They are the ones responsible for finding reviewers, for managing the review process, and providing that additional recommendation to the editor-in-chief. And then, of course, there are the peer reviewers. So some larger journals will have an editorial review board. These are reviewers that are commonly used, known to have subject area expertise. They're probably people who write and review for the journal quite regularly and have a good reputation for that. Some journals will use outside peer reviewers, either in addition to an editorial review board, or that's kind of just how they work. And they are selected based on their expertise. So going back to that first step, so you've submitted your article, that screening step. So what happens? So the kind of considerations that the editors are taking into account at that screening step is, first and foremost, is the topic appropriate for the journal? They might think about, is this topic important? Is it on an exposure that's really common, for example, or is it addressing some data gaps that are really necessary? They'll think about, is the paper likely to advance knowledge? Is it a novel concept? Maybe it has a particularly strong study design, or isn't conducted in a new population, or is confirming findings that really need confirmation. And they're really looking at, they're also looking at if the paper is coherent. So if a paper might be a good idea, but it's really unclear what the authors did, so maybe the methods aren't fully reported, or it's difficult to follow what the authors did, they might decide to reject the paper and not send it out to review. Something to keep in mind, peer reviewers are volunteering their time, and it's a lot of time and effort from reviewers. So if an editor reads a paper and think it might be interesting, but it's not coherent and not clear, and they don't think it's going to fare well in peer review, they might opt not to send that paper forward. So what this means to you, make sure to emphasize why your paper is interesting and novel, and just make sure your paper is well written and understandable. One tool you can use to kind of get your paper past that screening step is your cover letter. Not all journals require this, but if you can write one and submit one, I would. This is really an opportunity to sell your paper to the editors in that initial submissions or initial screening stage. You shouldn't rely on the cover letter. The paper itself still needs to sign on its own, but this is an opportunity for you to really provide, say, rationale for why you think your article is in scope for the journal, or maybe pointing out the most novel aspect of your paper. It's a place where you can provide additional context that might not fit in the text of your paper, but might be important for understanding your study. One key thing, don't repeat the abstract. The people who are reading your cover letter are also reading your abstract. There's really no advantage there. So you get past that screening step. The next step is the peer review process. So your paper goes out for peer review. Some things to keep in mind. You must convince your reviewers that your paper is worth their effort. If they read a paper that is not understandable, or they can't quite get the point, they might not provide a good review back to the editor. Try and predict what a reviewer might say and address it before submitting paper. So if you know there's a flaw in your study that was unavoidable, maybe mention that in your discussion section outright and say why that might be the case. If you're writing your paper and you're worried about that a reviewer might ask for a certain sensitivity analysis, go ahead and conduct the sensitivity analysis and include it. If you have that question ahead of time, then a reviewer is going to have that question ahead of time. Keep in mind, if a reviewer can't understand what you did, they'll question your methods and your research. So again, be clear and concise. Unfortunately, irritated reviewers are hard to please. So trying to provide information in a clear way is important to move. Another thing I'll mention in terms of if a reviewer can't understand what you did, keep in mind that reviewers represent your readership in the future. Right? So it's the same pool of people. The people who are going to be reading your papers are the people reviewing your papers. So if a reviewer can't understand what you did, a reader is probably not going to understand what you did. So it goes through peer review, goes back to the editor, and the next step is the decision process. So the handling editor will make a decision and provide comments back to the editor-in-chief. Their comments will be based on what the reviewer said and their own assessment of the paper. These comments will be included back in your decision letter when you get it, but these can be important in the revision stage or actually in the resubmission stage, particularly if your reviewers are discordant. So if your reviewers have differing ideas of what needs to be changed in your paper, look to the editor's comments to provide guidance. Also pay particular attention to any points emphasized by the editor, because those are the things that they thought were the most critical to change in your paper. So the possible outcomes here are a rejection, a request for revisions. Those can be major revisions, minor revisions. Some journals won't specify between the two and just provide them all together. Some journals will have an accept with revisions. Keep in mind that the revisions, even accept with revisions, acceptance is never guaranteed. You still need to make the changes to your paper that editors are requesting. And keep in mind, acceptance is very rare, extremely rare for a first draft of a paper. So say you get a rejection after review, what do you do next? You look for another journal to submit to. It's pretty important to revise the paper in response to the comments you got before submitting it elsewhere. First of all, just the paper will be better. Second of all, you might end up with the same reviewer, potentially even the same editor, actually. So if you are publishing an environmental epidemiology journal and you submit it to a different environmental epidemiology journal, that's a limited pool of readers and reviewers. So if you end up with the same person and they see that you did not account for the things they requested, they'll be irritated. So then now moving on to how to respond to reviews in your revisions. The request for revisions is a really good sign, but it does not guarantee that your paper will be accepted in the end. Be sure to respond to every comment or question provided by the editors and the reviewers. Again, if a reviewer has a question, it's likely a reader will have the same question. If you do not opt to make changes in response to a reviewer comment, be sure to provide very strong justification for not complying with that comment, either a scientific rationale or logistic rationale. Also consider mentioning and addressing the comment in the manuscript itself. Say you were unable to conduct a certain assay or analysis due to limited funding, or maybe there wasn't enough sample left. Mention that in the paper itself. Measuring this would have been helpful, but we were limited in the sample available. And that's why we didn't do it. You should consult with your co-authors when working on your revisions. And always just be as respectful and responsive as possible to the reviewer comments, and assume positive intent. The goal of peer review is really to create and improve the best science in papers possible. Nobody is really reviewing papers with any sort of negative intent. So some tips to responding to reviews: make it as easy as possible to follow your response. And copy the reviewer comments into your response itself. Respond to each comment in turn, including repeats. So say you have two reviewers, reviewer 1 and reviewer 2, and they both ask the same question or have the same comment. still respond to each comment. The reviewers, if they get back your revised version, might just be looking at your responses to their comments, not all of the reviews provided. You can refer back to the prior answer, but make sure to still respond. Be careful about indicating exactly what was changed and where. You can include the original and revised text in the response itself. Also use line numbers to show where the changes occurred. And I think all journals will request that you submit kind of a clean version of your revised manuscript and one that uses track changes. Make sure the track changes are accurately represent the changes you've created in your manuscript. One thing to keep in mind, the more clear your response, it really increases the likelihood of a speedy and successful review process. If it's difficult for reviewers or editors to see what you changed and how, it'll make it difficult for them to review your revised manuscript. So you submit your revised manuscript, and the possible outcomes that might happen. An editor may send your revised manuscript back for review. It usually goes to the original reviewers, but in some cases it may go to new reviewers. Just depends on what the editor thinks is necessary. The editor may make a decision without sending your paper back out for review. So based on your revision, they may accept or reject your revised paper as it is, or they may request revisions on their own. So say you submit your revised paper, it gets accepted, what happens next? So there is, for some journals, but not all, there is a copy editing and final review phase. This happens before publication, but after acceptance, where you might get final queries on your question. And it may range from kind of checking grammatical spelling errors, questions about your references and citation. They may actually provide suggestions for the content or organization of your paper. Be sure to respond promptly and completely to these requests. Again, your paper was requested, but it's not published yet. So make sure you are still responding to all of these kind of final queries you're getting to make sure your paper is ready to get out there. So after acceptance, you've kind of responded to all the final questions on your manuscript, your paper gets published. So that's kind of the final goal. It's a long process. Be sure when your paper does get published, you notify your co-authors of acceptance and publication. Be sure to promote yourself and your paper. It was a lot of hard work to get there. You can share it on social media, share it with colleagues or your institution. Just get the word out there about your work. That's all I have. I have a couple additional resources I want to share, and then I'll just open it up for questions or discussion. So I really focus on the submission process and writing. Last month, I believe, Katie Callahan, who's also a science editor with EHP, gave a webinar on the peer review process if you're interested in that, and that's on the ISEE YouTube channel. One other program that is kind of new-ish from ISEE itself is their peer editing program. And this is sponsored by the Capacity Building and Education Subcommittee of ISEE. And their goal is really to kind of promote those from low resource countries or underrepresented groups in publishing environmental health publications. The requirements here is that if you've submitted a paper to an ISEE partner journal, which is EHP and Environmental Epidemiology, and you've been rejected from one of those journals, you are open to apply and work with the peer editing program, and they will work with you to edit your program, edit your paper, and get it ready for submission to a new journal. So if you apply, or if you're eligible for this program, I would really take advantage of it. I think they're doing great things. So the website's there, and I think you can just go to the ISEE website itself, and there's information there if you have questions on that. The last thing I'll mention is at EHP, we do have an early career research initiative. We're engaging those who are kind of maybe just out of school or in their first kind of postdoc or graduate level training in the journal itself. As part of this, we are creating additional training and resources for publishing and peer reviewing for environmental epidemiology journals. Those should be coming soon, hopefully later this year. So keep an eye on that. As part of the Early Career Researcher Initiative, we also have, we are also developing a pool of reviewers for the journal who are all early career researchers. So if you are interested in reviewing for the journal and you haven't been invited before and you want to be involved with the journal, reach out to us. I think there's a link there, or you can go through the EHP website and look for, it's somewhere on the website. You should be able to find information on this and contact us. And yeah, I think that's all I have. I'll open it up to any questions or clarifications.
Yes, everyone, please feel free to either raise hand, unmute yourselves and ask, or type your questions on the chat. And we'll be monitoring all these.
So I mean, I can start with the question that I meant to ask at the beginning. Is how many people, if you can use your raise hand function, have, maybe I'll ask, have not published before, maybe working on their first publication? So I see a few hands going up. It's great. Hopefully this was useful.
Okay.
No questions. So clear.
No questions.
Oh, here we go.
Oh, here we go.
Oh, there's one.
Yeah.
Can you comment on best practices for suggesting potential peer reviewers for your paper if a journal requests it?
Sure. I mean, if a journal requests it, you can always provide them. They're helpful to a journal. I will say the journals won't always use the people you request, but there's no reason not to. In terms of finding potential reviewers, one thing you can look at, are there look for who the authors are of kind of your main citations that have published on something similar. So if your paper is on PFAS and obesity, look for people who have published on that same topic and request them as your reviewer, because they have the relevant expertise to evaluate your work.
Looks like we have a question from Veronica as well. Go ahead, Veronica, if you want to unmute.
Yeah, hello. Thank you so much for this training. Yeah, it's been helpful. My question is, if you need to choose between a journal with restricted access and one with open access, what would be your advice? And I would also want to know, the restricted access journal, do they pay the authors? Thank you.
Yeah, so I will say the restricted versus open access is one of the most confusing things about journals. At least that's my impression. I don't know if others find the same thing. I don't think there is necessarily specific, one is better than the other. The really key thing to keep in mind is whether your funding research, funding agencies require open access. So do they require your work is publicly available? I would say my personal preference is always to publish in a not restricted journal, because that means your work is most accessible to the most people. If you're publishing in a restricted access journal, that means readers who don't have access to pay for a journal, to pay to access the journal, won't be able to read your work. Right? So you're limiting your audience to those who have the resources or the means to read your work. The restricted access journals, they do not pay authors. It's actually the other way around. Usually you have to still pay a publication and a submission fee. I don't think there are any journals that will pay an author. That, unfortunately, that money needs to come from somewhere else. I hope that answers your question, Veronica.
Yes, thank you very much.
Question that I have, Saba. EHP has recently started offering research letters as an alternative to a full-length paper. So these are, I think there's around 700 word, 10 reference little research reports.
Yep.
Do you think you could share with folks why or when you might want to consider a research letter versus a full manuscript, and kind of what would be appropriate there and how to think about it?
Sure, happy to, and I'll say this is very specific to EHP. This is a newer article type that I think maybe we've been offering maybe just for the last year, maybe even less than that. And a research letter is really an alternative to a full-length manuscript. Say when the content of your work you don't think is enough for a full-length manuscript, but you maybe have some sort of novel finding that is interesting. It is something that can be used. I would say kind of one of the most useful ways to use it is if you're publishing on a cohort or a study that's been studied a lot, but you are doing maybe a new technique or a new analysis. So maybe one new lab assay in this study that wouldn't necessarily be enough, there wouldn't be enough meat for a full manuscript, but it's still novel and interesting. You can use a research letter for that.
Great, thank you.
If that's enough. So really what I would say, what we're looking for is that, is this something that is interesting? It might be interesting kind of like as a pilot study or a new marker that hasn't been measured before, but doesn't have enough meat for a full paper.
Great. I just wanted to point that out since it's a new option. And some other journals offer kind of these short report formats as well. So something to consider.
They do. And I will say one more thing about the research letters. There's still that expectation of clarity and with transparency in reporting. So even though they're limited in size, again, this is why this is my personal opinion, I think they're most useful for cohorts that have been published on before, because even if there's not enough room to report out your entire method section, you could hopefully use a citation to a prior publication.
Perfect. Okay, we have one last question. So let's finish up with your thoughts on use and avoiding reporting of p-values. Also kind of thinking about when to use the term statistically significant when discussing effect estimates.
Sure. Yeah, this is a good question. I think there's a lot of confusion and two different camps on using p-values and statistically significant. So I'll say, we don't like to see an over reliance on just looking at p-values to interpret your results, because p-values aren't necessarily only dependent on your actual findings. They're dependent or what kind of the true underlying association is. They are also dependent on everything from your sample size to kind of other factors related to it. So to the extent possible, the best kind of results section will compare findings, maybe not relying too much on the p-values, but on the differences we're seeing themselves. Of course, you can report p-values and use the term statistically significant, but I would just use it sparingly.
Wonderful. Well, Saba, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for joining us. This will appear on ISEE's YouTube channel in the next few days for those who weren't able to make it here today. And Saba, hopefully we're able to have you back again, because this is really great.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.